Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. It's Thursday, the 15th of April, and this podcast is George Hoare and myself, Alex O'Keefe. And today we're joined by a very special guest. Well, not that special, but actually I should rephrase that. Actually, they're a very special non-guest. It's our very own Philip Cunliffe.
Yeah, our special Bunga boy. We don't often introduce ourselves this formally, but today, yes, we are joined by Philip Cunliffe, Senior Lecturer in International Conflict at the University of Kent and one of the co-hosts of the Global Politics podcast at the end of history, Alpha Bunga Bunga. So Philip, thanks very much for making the time this evening.
You're welcome. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for letting me on.
We will have anyone on. No, we have a very strict vetting process for guests. So today we're looking at Phil's book from last year, The New 20 Years Crisis, 1999 to 2019, a critique of international relations. And so this is both a critique of the discipline of international relations, but also an account of the contemporary crisis of the liberal international order. So one of the things that we'll get into is how this book, as I'm sure Phil will explain, is itself a revisiting of one of the classic texts of IR, which is EH Carr's The 20 Years Crisis, 1919 to 1939. So looking back on that 80 years after its publication. Hopefully we'll get to discuss some of the echoes that interwar period finds in the contemporary one. Phil, so just to kick us off, could you tell us a little bit about before we get into the argument of Carr's book, a little bit about Carr himself, and for those who aren't IR scholars, what's his place in the history of IR as a discipline as well?
Yeah, so Carr, he's known as one of the most important Cold War era historians of the USSR, in fact, and that's probably what he's most famous for. He's got this monumental multi-volume history of the USSR going up to the early 1980s from the Russian Revolution. He's also the biographer of Bakunin as well as Marx, and during the Second World War, he was also a hugely influential leader writer for the Times newspaper, which even drew him the ire, not IR as in the discipline, but the anger of various
Thanks for clarifying.
Yes, you're welcome. The anger of various Tories in debates in the Houses of Parliament. He'd also been a British diplomat during the Paris peace treaties, the negotiations leading to the Paris peace treaties that brought the First World War to an end, and had been stationed as a diplomat in the Baltic states during the interwar period, while they were independent and before they were annexed by Stalin. He's kind of he had a life which gave him a kind of a tremendous deal of perspective in the first part of the 20th century, at least, on the kind of high politics and diplomacy of the time. And then he occupied, during the 1930s and before the Second World War broke out, he occupied the Woodrow Wilson Chair of International Politics at what was then the University College of Aberystwyth, which was a Victorian-era seaside resort town on the Welsh coast. And by this kind of this quirk of fate, it ended up being the first place to have an academic department, which was devoted to the study of international politics. It was endowed by a wealthy industrialist and powerful liberal politician of the day, David Davis, who was also a strong supporter of Woodrow Wilson and the Wilsonian vision of international politics. And Davis, in particular, was horrified by the fact that such a staunch opponent of liberal internationalism as Carr turned out to be an occupant of the chair prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. And I suppose what makes Carr so interesting from our vantage point, there's many reasons, but one in particular, is that in his book, he's a fierce critic of the liberalism of the day and the liberal internationalism of the day of the interwar period. And he saw this as an attempt to revive the high liberalism of the 19th century, of the Victorian era, as kind of one last gasp of liberalism before it was kind of swept away by the Second World War, by the rise to superpowerdom of the USSR, and by the kind of the new welfare state consensus that emerged in the wake of the Second World War. So he's a fierce critic of an earlier attempt to revive liberalism. And because we're going through a disintegration of liberal order again, after the era of neoliberalism from the 1970s to, I suppose, the early 2010s, maybe 2016, 2008, whatever.
A kind of neoliberal order breakdown, if you will.
Yeah, I guess. That would be maybe one way to term it. Yeah. So the breakdown of neoliberal order, because we're going through another cycle of that. it seemed to me an opportune moment to revisit Carr. I was listening a lot to this particular podcast, and it made me think about earlier criticisms of liberal order. And so I thought I would revisit one of the most significant critics of liberalism 2.0.
I think that's really useful on Carr. And he said that he's a staunch critic of liberalism. But what was his reading in this particular book, the period 1919 to 1939? Looking back on it from today, it's, I think it's characterized as basically a period of complete chaos, breakdown, rise of fascism, a lot of black and white, ominous videos of bad people massing in the street, Europe careering towards the Second World War.
Just like now. But
Indeed.
But the color videos now. But yeah, so what is, Carr as this critic of liberalism, what's Carr's analysis of this interbellum period? And why is this reading or this book so important within IR?
Yeah, so since the great financial crash of 2008 and all the kind of the political backwash that's followed, the rise of national populism, I guess, in the Western world, the election of Donald Trump, most obviously in 2016, many, endless commentators and analysts, they've repeatedly harked back to the interwar period as a harbinger of things to come for us. Economic depression, revived geopolitical rivalry, increasing nationalism and xenophobia, and then eventually, presumably, if that kind of sequence played out, it would be the wholesale collapse of international order.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting about Carr was, at least in the book, is how relative, in his book, the original New 20 Years Crisis the original 20 Years Crisis. What's interesting about Carr was how relatively calm he was about the supposed collapse of the interwar order. And in his book, The 20 Years Crisis, the reason, he was calm about it was because he saw it as this attempt to artificially prolong, as I mentioned, 19th century liberalism and to smother the new era of geopolitical rivalry and economic competition that was breaking out, to kind of try and contain that and smother it in Victorian era liberal internationalism. And in his reading, that what happened in the 1920s and 1930s is that this revival of liberal internationalism was driven by the US, because unlike Europe, the US hadn't yet transcended the liberal idealism of the 19th century. It had benefited from this unparalleled economic and political expansion because it faced no geopolitical threats on its own continent. And this enabled the US to avoid reckoning with the hard realities of competition for power with rivals of equal strength. So he counterposed this kind of naive liberal idealism, or utopianism, as he called it, with what he styled as realism. And for him, realism was the beginning of scientific thought in the study of international politics, which is to say a kind of a more inductive analysis, which was rooted in the fractious and conflictual reality of interstate politics. And so the critique, the book that he wrote, it was taken as one of the founding texts of the discipline, because he explicitly styled it as founding a new science of international politics. And the reason it was scientific is because it was rooted in the realities of mass politics, in the growth of state power and in nationalism that was kind of bursting the inherited dogmas of 19th century liberalism. And it's kind of ironic because the book also, ironically, it marked it was the kind of high watermark of British international relations, because by the end of the Second World War, the discipline had really become an American one. It was kind of set up by an influx of German academics fleeing the Nazis, and they would lay the grounds for the Cold War era discipline in the major US universities.
So just to be clear, in terms of that, what did Carr see as the origin of the crisis of 1919 to 1939? Is it just a case of the US acting with in a certain way in international relations, with essentially an outdated or outmoded or historically redundant at that point framework, or is it a materialist, or is it kind of there is economic conflict between great powers in Europe, and so this is necessarily going to lead to a crisis?
So the circumstances that the kind of particular conjunction of geopolitical and economic circumstances that were behind the era of high liberalism in the Victorian era, those had gone. The US missed this and therefore tried to kind of reimpose it in the wake of the First World War. And so it's the attempt to.
So it was never going to work.
Yeah, essentially that's his analysis. So, and that the framework which the US tried to impose on the messy reality of post-war Europe in 1919, so it sowed the seeds for the crisis of the 1930s, when German power began to reassert itself, as was inevitably the case given the centrality of Germany to European politics, and the interwar order that had been established in the Paris peace treaties that ended the First World War began to crumble.
One of the key terms that you mentioned already, but that comes out, really strongly in the book is Carr's understanding of utopianism, which you note is still the political unconscious of much of contemporary IR. So, what did Carr mean by this term, and how was it useful for him to understand the crisis of that 1919 to 39 period?
Yeah. So, what's particularly interesting about it is, when you debate the interwar period, utopianism is often used interchangeably with idealism or liberal idealism. And when Carr said utopianism, he meant it to apply to Wilsonian liberalism. Unlike us, right? Because from our vantage point of the early 21st century, we generally use utopianism to refer to fascism or communism in the sense of these artificial doctrines that simply cannot fit the actual reality of human life.
Because I don't know if you knew this, but utopia actually means no place. So
really?
These are called utopian because
that's really
Alex is looking at me like,
thank you.
That's a bottom 10% joke. That's a bottom 10% intervention.
Thanks, George. That's very useful.
But sorry, to get it back on track, it's specifically then a liberal utopianism, not a kind of trying to make a society that doesn't exist, as we commonly use it.
Which sounds kind of odd to us as well. No, sorry to just jump in, but yeah, like liberal utopianism is something that we're not really, or we seem not to be familiar with, right?
Yeah, that's the point, exactly, right? So the point was that liberalism was utopian. It was an ideology of a no place. It didn't. There was no kind of circumstances that fit that framework. And so from our vantage point, it's remarkable and striking that he didn't use utopianism to refer to fascism or communism, whereas he did use it to refer to liberalism. And he identifies 5 traits of utopian thinking, but arguably the most important one is the idea of the harmony of interests. And this is the idea taken from 19th century liberalism. So that essentially the view being, at least in Carr's take, is that all political conflict is essentially the friction of adaptation. So that there is essentially that all human kind of societies and polities and communities converge in an underlying common interest, which is essentially economic. Everyone has a mutual interest in the expansion of open markets and free trade. And as a result of this will lead to a spontaneous convergence among all of those different countries, states, peoples, nations. So according to this view, everyone shares essentially the same interests. Everyone has the same interest in free trade and open markets, and all interests will converge. Political conflict will wither away, and also political conflict is fundamentally irrational and even amoral from this liberal perspective that fuses economics and politics into a single integrated universal good.
No, that sounds nice. Get yourself some perpetual peace and some for everyone else as well.
So this view of political conflict, it's basically sees, this is the utopian, his critique of utopianism, that it sees political conflicts essentially just as insubstantial froth. And because they don't understand political conflict, this is why liberals fared so poorly in the interwar period.
So just one quick question, and then moving on to maybe IR as a discipline before bringing Alex in. But just so, I guess when listeners are thinking of liberal utopianism in that interwar period, you've already mentioned Wilson. What sort of institutions or what sort of events are particularly good illustrations of this? You mean of the... Like how was it enacted, or how was it instantiated, this liberal utopianism? Was it through diplomats? Was it the League of Nations? Was it just America acting in this way? What are the sort of illustrations that he brings in of this to kind of illustrate what liberal utopianism looks like? Specific clauses and provisions of the Paris peace treaties and the Treaty of Versailles in particular that were unable to account for the inevitable return of German power.
given the fact that Germany was prostrate at the end of the First World War, but also the design of the League of Nations and its particularly technocratic approach to resolving conflict, its inability to see conflict as rooted in fundamental incompatibility. And so its attempts to resolve conflict peacefully, according to Carr, paradoxically made the situation worse, because you needed to have the reality. You needed to be able to have conflictual interests openly expressed and honestly expressed in order to be able to negotiate honestly. Whereas with the kind of moral universalism that was promoted by the liberalism of the League, meant that everybody cast their claims in grandiloquent terms of universal morality and justice, and in these kind of high-flown phrases that made diplomacy deeply dishonest, and no one was able to actually get down to brass tacks of negotiating the interests that they actually had and wanted. And so, according to Carr, it's a whole kind of gamut, from the structure of power that America tried to impose in the aftermath of the First World War, right down to the kind of political and diplomatic rhetoric that clouded the conduct of negotiations and the way in which states tried to accommodate each other's interests.
Nice. No, I think it's really useful to have that historical background laid out before we kind of, I guess, get into assessing the present day. And before we turn on to some of those questions, just one final thing that I wanted to ask was, in the first part of this interview, is about IR as a failed discipline. I mean, one of the things that you lay out in the book about IR today is just the wholesale collapse of any pretensions of actually being an intellectual discipline that provides any sort of scholarly critique different to the practice of ordinary argument by lay people. I think it wouldn't surprise me if one or two of the examples that you draw are just fake, just put in there and nobody notices, and that's kind of the point of what you're doing.
Yeah, I thought the same.
No, they're really not. It's all
so
true.
You point to IR studies of everything from urinals in Scottish pubs to Hello Kitty, to scholars dressing up as their favorite characters from Star Wars or Game of Thrones. This apparently really happened. But what example best illustrates this, best encapsulates this kind of the present state of what IR? So if that was the high watermark, at least of British IR, and you didn't go into it in complete detail, but there's clearly the development of a quite a complicated picture of what states are and what they do and how they interrelate to each other and all these sorts of questions of power, economic, society, and so on. But what is the example that best encapsulates where IR is today as a failed or loser discipline?
So there's one event in particular that still stands out for me. I was at a major convention in Barcelona in 2017, and this was a few weeks, maybe a month, before the municipal government or the regional government held the vote on independence for Catalonia, which the central government in Madrid had already said they refused to recognize its legitimacy. And as part of this convention, there was a major roundtable with some leading, supposedly critical thinkers in the discipline. The room was packed.
Big names at the top table.
Big names at the top table. The room was packed out. I mean, I'd say, it's a big kind of lecture theatre style gathering, and I'd say probably, 200 people in the room. And not one of the panelists, there were about 4 or 5 people on the panel, not one of them mentioned the upcoming referendum on Catalan independence, nor indeed any of the kind of the larger questions of world politics at the time. And this was also the period when Donald Trump was saber-rattling against North Korea, because this was before the Singapore summit with Kim Jong-un. And so when someone in the audience pointed out the kind of this introspection and obliviousness on the part of the panelists, this was swatted aside by saying that the diplomatic crisis over Korea was of no consequence because the Joint Chiefs of Staffs would stop Trump if he did anything rash or irrational. And I remember I was completely astounded by this totally blasé response. And I wasn't astounded. It wasn't so much because I thought there was a significant risk of nuclear war over Korea, but rather because these leading, supposedly critical thinkers were effectively happy to rely on the US deep state to constrain a democratically elected leader so that they could continue pontificating on their favored topics. And on top of that, this total contempt for the major national question that was about to erupt in Barcelona a few weeks after the conference.
So,
Um,
I mean, can I just jump in?
That seemed to me to speak to what you said, George.
Well, I mean, I love that anecdote. I mean, I love reading that in the book. And obviously the bit about the scholars ignoring what was going on in Catalonia right there is pretty shocking. But at the same time, I kind of wanted to push back on Phil's interpretation, because isn't their reliance on the not reliance on the deep state, but their analysis that the deep state will stop Trump doing anything crazy, precisely an act of realism, or a kind of them using a realist lens and just looking at the realities of power, that basically the US deep state would prevent Trump from doing anything too crazy because of their own calculations and the certain amount of rationality embedded in those institutions and whatever. And so your complaints, Phil, that these scholars are ignoring democracy, well, that's just idealism, right? That's just sort of liberal idealism caring about democracy. Those scholars knew about the hard reality of power, that the deep state would intervene to stop a democratically elected president from firing a nuclear missile, for example.
Yeah, so I suppose I'd say two things in response. The first is that they're supposedly critical. So if they're, and that the casual kind of effective reliance on the legitimacy that they granted to the deep state is in conflict with the claims that they would, the way in which they would style themselves as critical luminaries. But the second thing is also that if it is kind of a political realism, it's a very fragile political realism, because it's based on opposition to mass politics. So it's based on the idea of these kind of embedded institutions that are needed to restrain mass politics. And that seems to me at some level, though it might be kind of, it seems to me not so much realistic as a veneration of power, and a veneration of a very fragile, a power that has been shown to be more fragile than we thought in the particular period that we're living through. I mean, you might call it the end of history, perhaps, something like that.
No, sure. But I mean, if there isn't mass politics, then a cold, hard-headed analysis of power and the exercise of it, and we'll look at the players on the chessboard and not talk about things like the masses or mass involvement in politics and democracy and so on, because if the masses aren't on the move, then they're not a player and they don't matter.
Oh, sure. But I suppose the point is this order was breaking down and they were oblivious to it.
Right.
So, you could be kind of, they suppose in one sense, they were also blithely accepting of the power of the central government in Madrid to crack down on the Catalan referendum, which indeed they did, with a significant degree of brutality and contempt for kind of municipal democracy and the kind of the wishes of Catalan people in that part of Spain. And that indicates kind of a breakdown, right? The disintegration of a particular kind of prevailing political system. So that doesn't seem to me to be realism in a meaningful sense, because it is ignoring the reality of political conflict. And also, I take Alex's point. This is, I suppose, this is what I'm trying to get at, is that there is a complicity between the kind of claims made by these critical scholars who claim to be distanced from critical, hostile, suspicious of existing institutions of power, when in fact they're in many ways bound up with it, complicit with it, reliant on it, to the extent that they would only kind of raise it when somebody criticizes them. So this wasn't kind of the claim about the deep state wasn't made in a critical way. And it wasn't made in it wasn't the discussion. It wasn't the opening gambit in a debate about what was going to happen over Korea. And like I say, nobody even mentioned what's happening.
Yeah. I mean, putting aside to 1 minute, I guess the possible contradiction between or just the reality that critical pretensions are not matched by critical thinking. There certainly seems to be some sort of theoretical shortcoming there to not be able to recognize an order in crisis and mistaking some aspects of fragility for solidity. But maybe just to move on to link this to what are some of the central theoretical premises of contemporary IR that maybe explain that kind of inability to analyze or to find analytically interesting some of these questions that you illustrated in your anecdote, Phil? One of the things that comes through in the book is that that basically IR is the theorization or the study of a certain sort of unipolar globalization, and this idea of the liberal international order in decline comes through as probably one of the things that you would put forward as a kind of way to look at what IR is. Could you maybe just expand on how you see the kind of characteristic theoretical approach of IR? What does it look like?
Yeah, so I characterize it as unipolar globalization, and the point of that was to say that that effectively, in the circumstances of the last 30 years, in which you've had overweening supremacy by the US at the global level, that it has overseen this enormous expansion of the global economy by drawing in East Asia, China in particular, into the global economy, and that has been the underpinnings of the liberal political order that we've seen recreated at the end of the Cold War for the last 30 years or so. And that this is, however, effectively this reality and the fact that it conditions all questions of our frameworks, of our understanding of conflict, of politics, of the theories. It's not actually that there's been a failure to acknowledge how much all of our ideas and frameworks are rooted in this underlying political reality. And as a result of this, there's a tremendous degree of conceited complacency with respect to the basic questions of power. So, for instance, that everything, as a result of this kind of overwhelming US power, what I think we've seen effectively is a recreation of the idea of a harmony of interests. So we've seen the same kind of phenomenon that all political conflict is essentially irrational, and the basic kind of political task of the day is homogenization of one sort or another. So liberalization, democratization, the spread of human rights, of prevailing gender norms in the West.
What's a good example of this? Sorry, just to jump in there.
So bombing Afghanistan to bring them women's rights, for instance, which we've been doing for the last 20 years, until...
we're getting there.
We're getting there. Well, except, now that obviously just the other day or just yesterday, the Biden administration announced the belated withdrawal from Afghanistan in September, 20 years after the terror attacks on the US in 2001. So this unipolar globalization has recreated this idea that all political conflict is essentially irrational, that it's fraught, that there are no real political antagonisms, that there's no real meaningful political conflict, that isn't just kind of the friction, a temporary friction as we adapt to the same underlying common interest. And essentially, all of the claim is, particularly in our study and understanding of international politics, that all of our claims reflect this underlying geopolitical reality, whether they're conscious of it or not. And the problem is that most of the people talking in international politics have not been conscious of this underlying geopolitical reality.
So IR is the study of temporary friction in the movement towards perpetual peace. Alex?
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things, which I thought was, I guess you sort of hint at, Phil, but which I found really remarkable, when you're talking about the way that the kind of all boundaries are broken down in IR, right? So people study IR will study all sorts of things, high and low, left and right, up and down, kind of all areas of social life, and brought into the study of international relations, which is crazy because I did IR at my undergrad, but at that time I don't remember there being such zany. I mean, there were maybe a couple of zany things at the far fringes of critical theory, but it wasn't like IR critical theory, but it wasn't like a mainstream preoccupation. But the way you described it in the book, it sounds like there's loads of people doing loads of stuff at serious conferences and so on about stuff like Hello Kitty or whatever, and I'm like, wow, that's stuff that kind of cultural studies might do. But I was amazed to learn that IR did it. And then it kind of hit me, or maybe kind of you suggested in the book, which is that maps on really well to globalization, because globalization is the flattening of the world, the breaking down of boundaries supposedly, and that intellectually the discipline of IR comes to reflect intellectually what is happening materially in the world with globalization, where there's no real boundaries between things. The states become permeable. There's no real hierarchy between, the state and then kind of non-state actors. They all inhabit on the same plane. So, and that therefore, as an IR academic, you can just as much study states as you can go and study some small kind of fetishism around a commodity of kind of community around Hello Kitty or whatever the hell it is, because all these things are equally valid.
Yeah. And so the underpinning for that is globalization and American power. So I make the case that kind of the expansion of the discipline. So, a normal person, I think a lay person would think that IR is about international politics, international relations is about the study of politics between countries. And the fact that the discipline burst its bounds in the last 30 years and spilled over into saturating so many things with meaning, from kind of the relevance of Star Wars, Hello Kitty. The examples are just endless and tedious. But it burst its bounds, and the fact that it burst its bounds kind of reflects also the this imperial globalization, essentially. The expansion, if you wanted to say kind of the expansion of the American empire, was reflected in the expansion of the discipline itself, that everything kind of became internal to the discipline, just in the same way that globalization taught us there was nothing that couldn't be commodified. International relations taught us there was nothing that couldn't be studied as if it was part of the same kind of political system.
So this is the just to clarify here. So you're talking about basically the second half of the 20th century. This is where these developments really played themselves out.
Even in the last 30 years.
Okay.
So since the end of the Cold War. So the last 10 years of the last century and the first 20 years of this century.
Cool. So maybe to move on to your reading of the crisis, 1999 to 2019. Because obviously this is one thing that you're saying is that we have this, this echo of the previous crisis that we talked about with Carr's reading of it. What are the key events of this crisis? What does it look like? What's the explanation? And then, is it right to finish in 2019? We can maybe get onto that point, or we still undergoing it. But several questions there. You can pick your favorite to kick off, but tell us about crisis.
Yes. So the contention of the book, or the conceit of the book, is that we've been through a similar 20-year cycle of crisis, a rise and fall of another version of liberal international order. If you want to say liberalism 3.0, perhaps, which can be stretched from 1999 to 2019. And it begins, so in 1999, there are two events, which I think legitimate the identifying the start of our 20-year crisis. Then it begins with the formation of the euro on the international currency markets and with NATO's war over Kosovo. And it ends in 2019 with the eruption of sustained popular protests around the world in late 2019, before planetary lockdown sets in with the spread of the coronavirus from East Asia. So there's a famous, I don't know if it's famous, but a well-known editorial from The Economist magazine in late 2019, which says the planet is in revolt because there were so many kind of all these protests erupting all around the world for all sorts of different reasons in the wake of the growing kind of political turbulence and economic crisis. And then it's all kind of effectively shut down by the various states of emergency that are imposed by governments around the world with the outbreak of the coronavirus.
So I think really it's kind of early 2020 it finishes, but that'll be a bit less neat.
A bit less neat.
We can give you that. It's 20, it's 20 years and 11 months. Or whatever. I'd say
20 years and maybe a couple of months. But I suppose the point being that I think it is legitimate to use the outbreak of the coronavirus and the kind of international response to it as a kind of to punctuate the end of a particular cycle.
Yeah.
But the beginning of the cycle, so the Eurozone, so it's an attempt to construct a currency. This is important with respect to Carr, I suppose, because it's an attempt to construct a currency union without a fiscal union in Europe. And it is, it is utopian. There is no other way, I think, to kind of capture the sheer irrationality of it. It's a monumental liberal folly. And I think it exceeds the liberal utopianism of Carr's day for sheer derangement and naive destructiveness. And, as indeed with the liberal idealism of the interwar period, the liberals double down at it. They amplify its destructive elements, and they insist in true utopian style that we will see convergence at some, that it transcends national politics and that it is the harbinger of a glorious future. So that was, that's one thing. It begins that Euro is officially formed in 1999, and the Kosovo War is the other element of it. And this was the liberal war par excellence. So again, the claim was that it transcended the kind of the parochial, egotistical interests of nation states. It was a war fought for human rights, an air campaign waged by NATO states, by a supranational alliance, and it flouted the sovereignty of the Serbian state because it was interfering in an internal conflict by seeking to hold the Serbian state's efforts to crush a secessionist insurgency in Kosovo. And the important element, I suppose, is that both of these moments laid the seeds of what would come subsequently. So the success of the Kosovo War would lure the US and the UK into overreach in Iraq in 2003. So effectively, it was Kosovo that inaugurated the Forever War. I think, and I think that's an important point to make. The idea of spreading the liberal ideals of human rights and democracy, becoming the rationale for war without any limit in terms of where those wars might end, because obviously spreading liberalism and human rights is something that will go on forever, could go on forever. And then the Eurozone debt crisis of the mid-2010s, which the final chapter of that is yet to be written.
So starting off with kind of intervention that leads to forever war and a kind of an attempt to build a liberal utopian community, and ending really finally with the coronavirus outbreak. That's, I think a nice sandwiching of that period.
Hello listener, Alex here. Sorry to interrupt, but we've got some very exciting news to tell you. That's right, BungaCast is pregnant. The end of history is soon here. The book, co-written by the three hosts of this podcast, will be out on the 25th of June. The end of history, politics in the 21st century, is our attempt to synthesize the discussions we've been having on this podcast for the past 4 years, and to advance an argument as to how and why the deadening end of history period had to end, and to look forward to what comes next. In it, we describe what the end of history felt like, and why what we're now experiencing is such a huge rupture. The hysteria of neoliberal order breakdown syndrome, the rise and fall of the left populism of Bernie or Corbyn, multiple varieties of angry anti-politics around the world, the new culture wars and mass protests, these are all facets of our new time. We also look at how new ideologies are emerging under the impact of the pandemic, which are set to rule the world for the next decade. And of course, our evil patron saint, Silvio Berlusconi, makes a big appearance. Understand his biography and his way of doing politics, and you understand the past 30 years. The book's available to pre-order now. Go to bungacast.com/book, where there's direct links to your favorite bookseller. Happy reading. We really do hope you enjoy it. It struck me, Phil, actually reading this discussion, or reading actually your discussion of this new 20 years crisis in the book, that there's this imperial overreach. And I think when people say imperial overreach, you're thinking about the US going into Iraq and that sort of whole folly there, where it didn't really need to go in. Or I don't know anything about Star Wars, so I'm definitely not thinking about that. But actually, there's a kind of deeper sense of imperial overreach, more than just crazy military adventures, which, I mean, I like this term that you use, inverted revisionism, where, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what that term actually means. But in some sense, it's a sort of the winners of the situation, the winners of the Cold War, instead of just governing this new order, exercising their hegemony and just kind of enjoying it and maybe handing out some scraps to make sure that everybody's happy, start going further and further and further where they don't need to, kind of undermining their own order. And that actually struck me, like, not thinking about international politics, but about domestic politics, where you have the same sort of, I guess, imperial overreach, or in your terms, inverted revisionism, where post politics at home as well is not just, hey, we've won, the kind of working class has been defeated, and therefore we're just going to govern this and make sure that people's incomes are reasonably supported so that everyone's happy and no one revolts ever again. Instead, they just push harder and harder. They repress wages more and more. They try to foreclose political contestation and create an almost sort of totalitarian system. I mean, not in the sense of the mid-century period, but a totalitarian system in the sense of having just a kind of only one way of going about things, total kind of technocratic control. And I guess you could contrast that with mid-century corporatist arrangements where, yeah, there was a domestic opponent, there was the working class, but you try to bring them in because you feared them, you feared the other or the subaltern, and you tried to negotiate, right? So you get them around the table, you get trade unions together with corporations, and everybody negotiates. The post-Cold War period is like, we've already won, and we're going to keep obliterating you, and we're going to keep trying to, and which ends up coming home to roost, as we're seeing now. You get populist eruptions and so on against this order. And it seems to me like that's a correlate of what happened in international politics, that instead of governing this new post-Cold War period and making everything nice, they went too far, they overreached.
Yeah, so revisionism is a more technical term from the study of international politics, and the idea is revisionist, that the kind of the classical era of revisionist states is taken to be the interwar period. So those powers who were excluded or in some ways oppressed or dissatisfied with the outcome of the Paris peace treaties at the end of the First World War, that they wish to revise the outcome of that, and therefore revisionist. They want to remake the international order to better accommodate their growing power and interests. And so the classic, the kind of classical revisionist states are Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and Fascist Italy, all of whom use
the real bad guys.
Well, they use the injustices, the outcomes of the treaties which dissatisfied their populations in various ways as justifications for their expansionism, their attempts to kind of flout international law, their attempts to remake international order and to subvert the rule of the League of Nations, the international organization of the day. So that's the kind of the prototype of revisionist powers. And then, the debate is repeated subsequently. So one of the debates right now is, is China a revisionist power or not? Or is it kind of more or less satisfied with the status quo? And what I suggest in the book is that what we see, in fact, is the weird kind of what happens very weirdly at the end of the Cold War is the status quo powers are the ones who are revisionist. And this is kind of unexpected from the kind of classical correlates of the study of international politics, that the US kind of becomes increasingly hubristic and overambitious and effectively goes on a rampage. There is no need for it because it's already on top and it's already won the Cold War. Why is there the need to spread democracy to places like Iraq, or to bomb Libya, or to try and overthrow the regime in Syria, or to make sure that women have rights in Afghanistan? I mean, there's no kind of geopolitical necessity to any of these conflicts. So it's remarkable. It's a kind of remarkable and strange thing. And this is why I say it's inverted revisionism, because rather than the kind of the dissatisfied powers, it's those who benefit the most from the status quo who are engaged in revising the international order. So it's a remarkably strange thing. And I think that you need kind of to acknowledge the sheer irrationality and the wantonness of the destruction of Iraq, for instance, on the basis of what's essentially a naive liberal idealism. So that's the kind of the idea of inverted revisionism. I'm not quite sure there's an exact correlate in domestic politics, and it's an intriguing thought, but I'm not sure there's an exact fit. And I'm very skeptical of the idea of saying that Western liberal democracies, for all their kind of pettiness and crudity and oppressiveness, particularly in the wake of lockdown, that they're totalitarian in any meaningful way.
No, but totalizing in the sense of not really having any real opposition anymore. I mean, if we're talking about the end of history period.
But I'm not sure that they pursued their victory, and also that they rampaged. It seems to me that there was kind of the increase in state power, the increase in surveillance, all this stuff which is unnecessary to manage populations because the population was already quiescent. The working class was defeated. Sure, but I'm not sure that they were driven. That they was driven by this kind of hubristic attempt to extend the gains that had already been made. And it seems to me there was also kind of many attempts to kind of pacify to pacify domestic populations, but in a way that was kind of manipulative and soft coercion, rather than kind of the outright brutality that we saw with the Forever War. So I'm not sure.
Yeah,
It's a thought. It didn't occur to me, but I'm not sure that there is a kind of a precise domestic correlate to what we see in the international arena.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about state failure with Lee Jones on some previous episodes, and I think there's some interesting points to pick up there in terms of what states have been able to and have ended up doing with respect to their populaces. But I wanted to raise a question about the implications of seeing this period 1999 to 2019 as a period of crisis, and particularly reading it in the way you do, back onto the period of interwar crisis that Carr wrote his book about. So I think maybe to put this a kind of finer point on it, if you have, does this mean that we need to retain these models from that period? Does this lead to a politics of anti-fascism and anti-appeasement? Should we be on the lookout for the next League of Nations failing? Should we kind of support an EU and a NATO army? Shouldn't we just bulk up those institutions? Because we don't want another fascism on the rise.
Yeah, exactly. So I suppose the ease or the felicity with which it's possible to draw parallels with the interwar period, I don't think that's accidental. In the sense, it's not just a kind of an aesthetic exercise or an intellectual game, but I think the fact that it can be done tells us something significant about the structure of international order itself, which is that liberal internationalism itself depends on, it's legitimated by pulling us back from the precipice. So the 20 years crisis, one of the claims of the book is that the 20 years crisis is in effect built into the functioning of liberal international order itself, because liberalism at this kind of deeply kind of decayed and senescent form that we have now, late liberalism by the beginning of the 21st century, it can only legitimize itself by kind of holding us back from the precipice of, and this is why, how many times we're kind of warned of the dangers of appeasement, how many times we're warned about the dangers of a depression, which will lead to the rise of extremist politics and the far right and xenophobia, and will lead to the collapse of international order.
Or they've already been on the rise.
Well, or that the international, the UN will disintegrate like the League of Nations, despite the fact that the UN has been around now for decades longer than the League ever was. So that there's always this kind that liberal internationalism can only survive by the recreation of crisis. And most recently, for instance, I saw with the deal that the Biden administration is trying to stitch together with the Bolsonaro government in Brazil. They're trying to pay off the Bolsonaro government billions in order to preserve the Amazon rainforest as a way to offset global carbon emissions and to prevent the Amazon to perpetuate the Amazon rainforest as a carbon sink. And that this has been the Biden administration's kind of negotiations have been criticized by environmental NGOs as being appeasement. So it's an extension, an appeasement of the Bolsonaro government. So it's an extension of the debates and the logic of the 1930s, of the kind of anti-fascism and the idea that we're constantly on the brink of some cataclysmic breakdown in order, a breakdown in political order, and a descent from our kind of our limited gains that we have into some kind of pit of barbarism. And this is the way liberal internationalism legitimates itself. So insofar as it's a legitimate, insofar as it's intellectually legitimate to make the comparison, I think it reflects the reality of international politics itself. And this is what I think I'd like kind of the readers to take away from the book, is to think about how our thinking about international politics tells us something about the underlying structure of international power.
So I just wanted to return to something in the book, which I found really interesting. A lot of it, or the middle chapter, is dedicated to two sorts of theories which are supposedly critical, but you cast as, or you charge with being utopian, constructivist and critical theory. And it struck me reading that. I mean, maybe it'd also be interesting for you to explain a little bit, because you haven't spoken so much about that section of the book, to first maybe briefly explain what your criticisms of those are actually before I make my point.
Yeah, so they're two kind of very influential theoretical strains, very prevalent, kind of widely studied and applied and used in the discipline with students and scholars and social political scientists and what have you. And constructivism is the idea that identity, it's I'm kind of summarizing and condensing, but the essential claim is that identity trumps interest. And so that you don't have a kind of a hard interest, which is prior to identity, but rather that if you have kind of these flexible, malleable identities, which are socially constructed, it's possible to change identity, and therefore it's possible to potentially create a kind of a more harmonious international order. A change of identity will change interests, and people will relate to each other in new ways, and we're able to kind of transcend the conflicts of the past. And critical theory obviously is has its roots in all sorts of radical politics, and the idea there is that we have to relate our ideas to what our aspirations are. And so the famous kind of slogan of critical theory is all theory is for some purpose, which was one of the claims made by the late Robert Cox, who is one of the kind of great critical theorists of the discipline. And so there are two streams, and I say that both of them are actually far less critical than they think, and despite whatever they claim about themselves, they're both in effect liberal theories of international politics, even though they claim not to be.
Yeah, and so what I found interesting I remember like being quite drawn to these sorts of theories when I studied IR as an undergrad, because it got beyond the kind of stale division between like liberal idealists and hard-headed and kind of often conservative realists. And so you could say, well, maybe we could imagine the world to be different to what it actually is, get beyond just the sort of naked conflict of interest and so on. Not conflict of interest, but conflicting interests in the international arena. But it also struck me reading about your description of Robert Cox, which was really interesting, about this idea that he tried to induce a bit of reflexivity in the theorist. So to think like, okay, if you're theorizing something, think about your own position and what you're trying to, what your own purpose is. And that all seems pretty useful. Like and I think you can see that, like, well, actually there's quite a lot of usefulness to it. And it struck me then thinking about kind of critical theory, let's say in the most broad sense, and probably including a lot of post-structuralist thought about kind of all sorts of new forms of supposedly radical social thought from the past 40, 50 years. A lot of it actually is a useful corrective. And that's kind of what you're saying about critical theory in IR, that it was kind of a useful corrective to a lot of the dominant strains in IR thinking, even certain constructionist elements being like, well, actually, maybe states' identity does matter, that it's not, you can't just take states' national interest for granted, that different states will behave differently because they have different constitutions. A revolutionary state will act differently to a very conservative monarchy or whatever, right? Things like that. That's a good corrective. And I thought that applies to kind of supposedly critical theory across the board, isn't it? That it was like, it's kind of a corrective theory. A lot of this stuff emerges as a critique against the establishment, or even against the left-wing establishment, maybe Stalinism or Laborism, which then becomes completely unmoored and becomes self-standing. So you can think of like feminism, where feminism, the famous slogan, "The personal is political," it starts off as a critique of machismo within left-wing organizations, and that's quite useful. I think they're right to make that critique. But then it becomes unmoored and becomes a general slogan for politics as a whole. The personal is political, which has become almost hegemonic today. In fact, it probably is hegemonic today. The boundaries between private and public have been completely broken down, and have been broken down by elites, by states, by power as a whole. And, you can think of other examples here as well, like ecological kind of criticisms. You can say, well, that's a useful corrective to Soviet late industrialization, which laid waste to huge areas of sort of natural Russia, and had terrible feedback effects on human populations. Huh?
natural Russia.
Yeah, they couldn't figure out how to say that. Whatever,
Mother Russia.
Of the natural world in
Holy,
Russia.
holy Mother Russia.
Yeah, I should probably rephrase that. But anyway, you know what I'm getting at. That basically, polluted water and whatever, etc. And that's useful, and that's a useful critique, a useful corrective. But then it becomes a self-standing, unmoored perspective of ecological thought, which ends up becoming quite reactionary even. And so I don't know, it struck me that this kind of applies a lot across the board, that what starts off as a useful corrective has then become unmoored, self-standing, and ends up becoming hegemonic and a handmaiden to power.
Yes, I mean, my sympathy, certainly with certainly kind of when I started studying all this about 15 years ago now, was as an undergraduate. I mean, my sympathies were kind of with you, in the sense of that it seemed to me kind of more intellectually stimulating, productive, and useful to go beyond understanding international politics purely in terms of counting who has so many tanks and rockets and so on, which was the kind of, but again, I mean, that was partly a stereotype of what the discipline supposedly had been in the Cold War that was taught to us as a foil for introducing these new ideas in the kind of undergraduate lecture hall. And I'm still kind of an admirer, though, a critical admirer of Robert Cox. And like you say, so when he said theory is always for some purpose, what he was trying to do is to try to kind of cultivate a sense of reflexivity, to encourage scholars, students, analysts of international politics to reflect on how their own ideas were shaped by the context, and how various kind of underlying power structures would be expressed through their own ideas, as well as through the ideas of the people they're criticizing. What that has become, though, right, is theory is always for some purpose, is become now simply like what kind of a critical, queer kind of critic of international law and animal studies or whatever. I mean, I'm caricaturing, but only slightly. The idea is now that you simply state your purpose, and if your purposes are good, then your theory is good. And so it's kind of,
if you build it, they will come.
It's become it's flipped over.
Not sure that's the same thing.
So it's a statement instead of kind of being an injunction to relating yourself to your own context. It's become a announcement of normative intent. And obviously everyone has good normative intentions, and this is a way to essentially legitimate your own kind of claims.
So IR has become political, but the politics, small p political, but the politics precedes a theory. In fact, I wanted to.
And it's not become analytical, right? It stopped becoming kind of.
It stopped becoming analytical.
I wanted to pick up on
just before you do that, okay. George. Yeah, just to kind of wrap up the answer to Alex, is I think, but the seeds are contained in the earlier claims. So I mean, the point about Robert Cox is he banks on the third world, and he admits, like towards the end of his life, he admits that he was a Jacobite. So Jacobitism, the kind of the revanchism of the failed kind of attempt to reinstall the Stuart dynasty in England, is he's sympathetic with this, with kind of the lost cause, and it's the romance of the lost cause that draws him to the idea of third world emancipation and revolt. He knows that it has kind of very definite limits, but he feels by his own admission in an interview towards the end of his life, he kind of feels drawn to the underdog. The same way that the Whigs were kind of wiping out the Jacobites, he feels drawn to the third world standing up against the American empire. But it's gone. The third world went with the end of the Cold War. There is no independent position now between Moscow and Washington. He bet on the wrong course. So the seeds, it's not that it became kind of that it went too far or that it was a corrective. I think the seeds of its own kind of the problems were laid earlier, and they can be identified in the intellectual choices made by people like by Robert Cox earlier in the 20th century.
So something which you've both picked up on studying IR as undergraduates and beyond that. And I had a question about something you pick up in the book, just a question in two parts. The first thing is that you say, for who indeed would want to study domestic politics with the likes of Tony Blair, Jacques Chirac, Lionel Jospin, Schroeder, Clinton in charge? Well, who indeed? But some of us on this podcast
remembers Lionel Jospin? So we just about remember Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. Who the hell is Gerhard Schroeder and Lionel Jospin?
Well,
that's
some
just
of us
being Anglo. That's just being Anglo-centric.
No, but it's a serious point, right? Because Lionel Jospin was defeated.
Yeah.
He was a socialist,
but Schroeder,
defeated by Jean-Marie Le Pen.
But Schroeder was important.
So was Jospin, right? But they're defeated kind of figures,
So the question, I guess, that comes out of this is how the kind of the impulse. Let me put this in the right way. The impulse to study IR, or the looking for problems internationally, like who does that appeal to, and what sort of, I'd put in my notes, what's the role of IR in the socialization of the PMC? And I don't think that's maybe not quite right, but certainly when I was teaching students at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, they all wanted to work for the EU. This was there was an Area Studies Europe course. And they wanted to work for NGOs, ideally the EU, that kind of specific impulse to kind of have a high status, internationally focused job, solving kind of the big problems of the world and bringing peace and justice globally. So what is the role of IR in the kind of the socialization of these cohorts of people who will work in international institutions, NGOs of various sorts?
Yeah, so this is a part of it's a claim I make in the book, and I imagine Alex, as a former LSE IR twink, will have his own an LSE.
Is that a thing?
Twink. It's definitely a thing. He'll remember this. He's not a twink anymore, but when he was. So, but yeah, I make the claim that IR, the kind of the MA in IR or the MA in IR or international relations, or international relations adjacent disciplines, such as peace and conflict or terrorism studies or critical terrorism studies or international law or human rights, or, there's a whole gamut of them. But they were crucial to socializing a whole generation of particularly kind of ambitious, kind of bright, young, kind of middle class students, young people. And it was a very important part of politics at the end of history, because the appeal of it, right, was that it allowed you to kind of vault over your own society, to distance yourself from your own society, because at the end of history, obviously, all major problems had been resolved, right? There were no fundamental conflicts at home. And so the most important problems were essentially those of resolving kind of mopping up operations. What was left at the end of history was like, the Israel-Palestine conflict, or gender rights in Tibet or Nepal, or, it was all seen as kind of marginal. The big problems that were left were all kind of residual, mopping up operations, because the central questions of politics had been settled in the core, in the advanced liberal democracies, the advanced capitalist societies of the West. And so the MA in international relations, the postgraduate study, that was the kind of entry ticket to working for, or for those who aspired at least to work for their foreign services, for the institutions of the European Union, for major kind of NGOs, for major think tanks.
Kind of globalist mandarins, I guess.
Yes, right? Exactly. Yeah. So kind of aspirant globalist mandarins, the MA in international relations and the adjacent kind of qualifications were very similar to the MBA. Of. So, and it was those two, I think, were your ticket to being kind of a globalist. Maybe if you're more kind of Mandarin inclined, NGO inclined, kind of IO inclined, you would go.
Or you have a good heart.
Yes.
And you're not just about that filthy lucre.
Yeah, you would go for the MA in IR. And if you were kind of more, more motivated by money, you might go for the MBA. And so those were the kind of the two choices for the kind of globalist elite. And those who aspired to be the globalist elite. So it was a very important. So international relations isn't just kind of, I suppose the point is this, right? It's not just a kind of a particular academic field for understanding international politics. It was also an engine of socialization for a whole cadre of people who would go on to become NGO apparatchiks, international civil servants, domestic civil servants, and even, black bloc protesters at the anti-globalization riots of the late 1990s, early 2000s, where there was the idea that you could kind of directly kind of affect global politics by protesting outside the conferences of the World Bank or the IMF without needing to engage in the messy kind of national politics of parochial interests within your own state.
Yeah, avoid parochialism at all costs. In terms of, I guess, maybe just to wrap it up and look forward, what's next? What comes next? So, this period is over. I'm not going to ask you to predict what comes after COVID or any of that sort of thing, but you've kind of explained how the study of IR is tied to this unipolar globalization, this liberal international order in decline. What's going to be its role in American hegemony in the next 20 years? Do you have any hot takes on this?
I suppose, the take-home point, I suppose, would be that US hegemony, obviously it's not to say that US hegemony is a function of international relations as an academic study or as an ideology, but rather that international relations is a function of US hegemony. And that will be its status, its position, and the various kind of theoretical claims that are made by people studying in the discipline. All of these things will be transformed as the margin of US power erodes. So I don't think the US is going to be overtaken by China or anything like that imminently, but certainly the margin of US kind of supremacy is going to be eroded, and that will have significance for international politics as well as how we think about it. I suppose I'd finish on this. So what's really interesting and striking to me is how, and I suppose this is the question I'd want our listeners to go away and think about, is
you're giving them homework. This is what you're saying.
No. Well, maybe. Feel free to get in touch, Patreon listeners in particular, or any others, on Facebook or Twitter. But I suppose the question is, how important is geopolitical rivalry to changing politics? Because one thing that's really striking is how, so at the moment, various Biden economic programs are very much in the news as they're being kind of propagated. And so many of them are being justified by reference to or at least some of them are being justified by reference to the need to beat China. And so there's, in the head of Biden's National Economic Council, Brian Deese, if listeners want to go and check out an interview with him done recently on the New York Times pod, he has a tremendously much more ambitious than usual economic program. And he justifies it not only in economic terms, but also in terms of social policy as a renewed vision for America, about the need to kind of restore the status of the American worker, about the need to bring kind of industry back home because these overextended supply lines are now kind of geopolitically vulnerable, because China is a state capitalist system, which an America needs to adapt to become more state capitalist to meet the kind of geopolitical challenge posed by China. And so I suppose this is the thought, is how far geopolitical rivalry leads to a revival of politics, because the whole point of my book is to critique the era in which the claim was that we'd transcended the pettiness of political competition between states. And if you have political competition between states again, does that have significant ramifications for politics as a whole?
IR at the end of history. So yeah, thanks for joining us, Phil.
Thanks for having me on, guys. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, maybe we'll have you on again at some point.
We'll don't call us. We'll call you. But thanks a lot for your time this evening. And yeah, see you next time.
Nothing to lose. Stuck inside a Memphis with the